Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Oughton and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I hate this. I like to torture him. That's right, boys. It's Dr. Venkman.
Welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast. Today's interview is with biochemist Fazale Rana. He's the Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He's the author of several groundbreaking books, including Who is Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Humans 2.0. He holds a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University. We'll be talking to Fuz about RTB's forthcoming book, Thinking About Evolution, 25 Questions Christians Want Answered, in which he's a contributing author. Well, thanks for joining us for the show today, Fuz.
Well, thanks for having me, Brian and Chad. It's great to hang out with you guys.
Well, we're focusing today on another book that has been recently released, Thinking About Evolution. Tell the listeners a bit about yourself and why you and the team at Reasons to Believe decided to write this book and its overarching goals.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a biochemist by training, and I'm also a Christian apologist, and I currently work with a ministry called Reasons to Believe. In fact, have been with RTB for over 20 years now. And the overarching purpose of our organization is really to build a bridge between science and the gospel. So we really consider ourselves to be as much an evangelistic organization as an apologetics organization, where we look at how can we use scientific discoveries to demonstrate the evidence for a creator's existence and the reliability of Scripture. But also part of that enterprise involves engaging ideas from science that many people see as a threat or a challenge to the Christian worldview. And obviously one of those ideas is the large concept or the broad concept of evolution.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it would be helpful for our listeners kind of starting out if you were to define maybe what we mean by evolution. Are there different meanings, definitions, and then what are the dangers of kind of equivocating on these definitions?
Yeah, and the idea of evolution in general, and of course here we're referring to evolution in the biological realm. The problem here is that there's a number of different approaches that Christians have taken. First and foremost, when it comes to evolution, one approach would be to just simply reject the idea outright. The other approach would be to try to accommodate it and incorporate it into Christian theology. And then I think the position we embrace is kind of a middle position, which is not to simply reject the claims of evolution outright, but really to be critical and thoughtful about, about the claims that come out of the evolutionary paradigm. And so I wouldn't say are anti-evolutionists in terms of the way we've approached the issue in the book, nor are we advocates for the evolutionary paradigm, but rather we recognize that there are some aspects of evolutionary theory that are well evidenced. Other aspects are inferences that are strong inferences. Other aspects are weak inferences. And there's some places where we believe the evolutionary paradigm lacks explanatory power. And for your question, Chad, the easiest way to think about that is to make sure we truly understand what we mean when we use the term evolution. It is an equivocal term, in my opinion, and in the opinion of the author team. And so, for example, we've got a lot of evidence that demonstrates that variation can happen within a species. Sometimes this concept is dubbed microevolution. It's clear to me there's good evidence that one species can evolve into a closely related sister species. This is called speciation. And there's also very good evidence that microorganisms evolve. We are all in a lockdown around the world because of COVID-19. That's a beautiful example of evolution happening, in at among microorganisms if you assume viruses are alive. But then there's other claims that are part of the evolutionary paradigm, namely that evolutionary mechanisms can have bona fide creative power, that they can generate biological innovation and novelty. And typically, these claims are connected to what we might call macroevolution, where now evolution is used to account for the origin of the major groups, and then there's also what we might call chemical evolution, which would be the process in which life got started, where the claim is that molecules could self-organize into the very first cells. And so these are, different facets of the overarching theory of evolution, where I would argue that, microevolution, speciation, and microbial evolution are well evidenced. I'm not completely convinced that macroevolution, if you will, is as strongly evidenced as people might think. And when it comes to chemical evolution, the consensus, quite honestly, in the scientific community is nobody knows how life could have emerged through evolutionary means. And so there are facets that I think our skepticism is justified, other facets where I think we should feel comfortable embracing. And it turns out, from my perspective, that area of evolution that seems to be well evidenced poses virtually no threat to the Christian worldview. And those areas where it's least evidence are areas that someone might see that as being a threat to Christianity.
One part of that question, really, your answer there really hit home with me in regard to, I didn't get the sense that as I read through the book that it was some kind of polemic necessarily against evolution. It certainly wasn't advocating, meaning evolution on the kind of the grand macro scale, if you'd like, or it was necessarily endorsing it. It was more saying, here's what we've come to discover. Here's what the evidence is. And you were kind of assessing throughout which claims actually meet their evidential burden and which ones don't, which I thought was, pretty fair-minded way of going about it.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, if somebody holds to an evolutionary perspective on life, they are well within their rights to do that. We do see a fossil record that reveals a history of life on Earth, where there's different life forms at different times in Earth's history. We see shared biological features among organisms that could find explanation in this idea of common descent.
Sure.
But one of the things that we try to do in the book is really help people to think through evolution themselves. So we try to lay out certain principles, like we've already talked about one. What is it that you exactly mean when you use the term evolution? And there's other terms or concepts in evolution that are also equivocal, like transitional, intermediate, and things like that. So it's really important to make sure you understand what you mean when you use that term and what other people mean when they use those terms. That can go a long way towards making sense of it. Also, I think it's important to understand that there are philosophical pre-commitments on the part of evolutionary biologists that force them many times to view life through an evolutionary lens as opposed to really looking at what the data actually says. And there's other ideas in the philosophy of science that really, I think, come to bear in terms of how we think about, evolution. One big idea is called the underdetermination problem, which means that theories are underdetermined by data. In other words, just because you have data that's available to you that supports a particular theory doesn't mean that data rules out all other theories. That other theories that in some instances that can be radically different than the theory you're espousing can likewise find support in that data and can accommodate that data, which means that, that evolution, if you will, quote unquote, is not the only way to interpret the data that we see in biology, even things like the fossil record or shared, biological features.
Before we get into some of the more specific topics within the book, maybe you could just talk about how the book's laid out. Now, there are multiple authors with different areas of expertise. There's even a chapter in there about critical thinking, which I love that. That's great to include in this sort of at the outset,
Right.
because it exposes some of the things like equivocation about the terms we're using when it comes to evolution. But would you talk, Fuz, just about the overall structure of the book and how it progresses? It's the subtitle is 25 Questions Christians Want Answered. So just give our listeners an idea of sort of the arc of the book, if you will.
Yeah. Well, when we discussed doing this project, initially I wasn't frankly all that enthusiastic about doing it. And part of the reason is I didn't want to produce another book on evolution. I didn't want to produce a book that was going to be perceived as just simply bashing evolution. I wanted us to do something more, thoughtful. And I also was concerned because the idea of biological evolution is an incredibly expansive area in science. And there's no way in a reasonably sized book that you're ever going to be able to engage all of the ideas that are really part of evolutionary theory. And so the approach that we decided to take was, first of all, to try to identify the questions that we hear people ask oftentimes about evolution. And then also, we try to construct questions that would at least provide responses to what we consider to be linchpin ideas in evolutionary theory. So the book is not an expansive, exhaustive response or engagement of evolution, but it rather is a selective engagement where we're hoping that the questions that we pose are the kinds of questions that people would typically ask, and also questions that would get at really the central issues at stake when we start thinking about evolution.
Yeah, one of I think it definitely succeeds in that. In what you just said, that goal was definitely met. Just so listeners can, if you're interested in this topic, it definitely meets that. But one of the things I also thought was really interesting is that on the onset of the book, not only do you, as Brian said, talk about critical thinking and because that's so important, but one of the things I also thought was really interesting is on the onset, you guys make clear, and you even call it this, of your bias. So you say this in the book. It says, revelation is always God initiated, whether in creation or in Scripture. It is utterly reliable. Scripture itself teaches us these things. So we have the confidence of sound reason in Scripture in approaching the unity of God's revelation. Then you guys go on to explain that you hold to a progressive creation model. And in my experience, and you, of course, have much more experience than I do in this area, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's typical for books on evolution to start out almost setting this foundation of, I'm only looking at this through pure, unadulterated reason, as if I am 100% objective, I have no biases, where I found it really refreshing that you guys were willing to say, hey, look, we have biases. We're admitting them up front. And so I was just totally curious as to what was your motivation in kind of showing your cards there, if you will, right from the beginning.
Yeah, well, as you point out, I think everybody has biases, and the process of trying to figure out what really is true begins, I think, with acknowledging what my bias is, and trying to understand what your bias is, and recognizing that our biases are things that we have arrived at based on our experiences in life. So as a Christian who holds to the inerrancy of Scripture, there are certain, commitments that I have that go along with that. As a scientist, I also have certain commitments, and all the four authors have all arrived at progressive creation as the model that we choose to look at, the life sciences through, again, years of investigation of the evidence at hand, where we feel like that position explains things. But we recognize that, again, we could be biased, and because of that, we may not give the same credence to evidence that another person might find to be absolutely compelling for common descent or for an evolutionary history of life. So we feel like pretend you don't have a bias really isn't, as you're pointing out, isn't true. So it's better to say, look, this is where we're coming from. And maybe in doing so, you can help people who don't have that perspective begin to see how you think about the data and begin to understand the lens by which you're looking at the data, with the idea that, is that person rational?
Yeah.
To hold that perspective in light of their pre-commitment.
Yeah, I found it really refreshing. And I also think that if more people were, and this is just, again, my kind of personal observation, I think it was instructive to me because I was impressed, it impressed upon me how refreshing it was. And I thought, wow, it would be really interesting if everybody was willing to just say, hey, look, I've got my biases. I'm trying to be as objective as possible here. And if you disagree with me, feel free to, disagree and call me on it. I think that it would really open up dialogue a lot more.
I want to follow up with a question about Chapter 5. It's entitled, Is Evolution Really a Problem for the Christian Faith? And there you're sharing that you began in college as an agnostic, and you were convinced that evolutionary mechanisms were more than adequate to account for origin, design, the history of life. But then you say that in graduate school, you began to change your perspective. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that, how you did accept the view, but then you questioned it and changed your view. So talk to our listeners a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there were two things at play there. First of all, by the time I graduated from high school and entered into college, I was, again, uncertain about God's existence. And so within that perspective or that framework, as I was taking courses in biology and in chemistry, I didn't have any reason to question the grand narrative that I was learning in my biology classes, which is evolution. It can explain everything that we see in biology. And in fact, that perspective actually reinforced my agnosticism because, if mechanism can explain everything, then there really isn't a reason to appeal to a creator. What role would a creator necessarily play? And so it wasn't like I gave a lot of thought to the evidence, really. I just simply accepted it because this is what, it was the prevailing ideas. But when I got to graduate school, first of all, part of a graduate education in the sciences is to really learn to think independently, regardless of what everybody else around you is thinking, that you look at the data and you draw conclusions from the data. And that means that you have to be courageous at times. You have to go against the mainstream at times. But if the data supports that, then that's what you're obligated to do, as a scientist. And so I took that message to heart. And as I began really studying biochemistry in depth, there were two things that I was deeply impressed by. One is what we could call the design of biochemical systems. They just incredibly elegant and ingenious and sophisticated. And I began to ask questions. How do scientists explain, where these systems come from? This is really the origin of life problem. And as a graduate student, as I studied the different explanations, I thought this just doesn't work in my mind. And so I realized that at least when it came to the origin of life, that this is a place where evolution didn't seem to work. And so that meant that there was, to me, a mind behind life itself. And that opened me up to the gospel message and led to my conversion. But this was the first point in time where I realized that maybe, just maybe, the grand claims of evolution aren't true. And I held to the idea of theistic evolution for a number of years as a graduate student and then a postdoc, and as I began my R&D career prior to joining Reasons to Believe. And over time, just gradually saw more and more cracks in the evolutionary paradigm that I thought could be places where, again, perhaps a creator might have actually intervened, as with the origin of life. And so that kind of led me away from a position of, evolution to kind of a theistic evolutionary perspective to really a progressive creationist perspective.
In that, you mentioned theistic evolution, and one of the things as I was reading through this book, that's a topic that I am finding. I became a Christian when I was 25. I'm 44 now. I remember when I first became a Christian, theistic evolution was kind of this outlying strange, weird phenomenon, whereas now it seems like more and more people are defending it, holding to it. And that's something that I've been looking into recently, just trying to understand it. And first of all, could you kind of tell us a bit for our listeners, especially like kind of describe a bit about what is theistic evolution? And then also in your on this same chapter, Is Evolution Really a Problem for the Christian Faith? You kind of point out some serious philosophical problems with theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, whatever you want to call it. And could you maybe share briefly a bit about those? So that was wordy. So define theistic evolution and then tell us some of the problems you see with it.
And I want to say that I know a number of people that are leading advocates of theistic evolution, or evolutionary creation is another way that it's described these days, particularly by our friends at Biologos.
Right.
And I consider many of these people my friends. They are clearly brothers and sisters in Christ. So I don't see, whether or not you see God employing evolution as the means to create as kind of a litmus test for how committed you are to the Christian faith.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. And so in a nutshell, the idea of theistic evolution is that God has utilized evolutionary mechanisms as the means to bring about his creative purposes. And, in principle, I don't have anything fundamentally wrong with that view. I held that view myself. But to me, and there's different flavors of theistic evolution, by the way, in terms of, how God was involved and to the degree and to the extent, so there's almost as many versions of theistic evolution as there are people that hold that view, so it's not a monolithic view, to be certain. And there's some expressions of theistic evolution that I think really bump into old earth creationism or progressive creationism, and others that are, at the opposite end of the spectrum. So again, it's a kind of in terms of the details or the specifics, it's very difficult to provide those simply because there's such a range of views within that umbrella, right? Or underneath that umbrella.
Sure.
But to me, the thing that I find philosophically disquieting is it's one thing to say, hey, maybe God created through mechanism. But when you look at the nature of the evolutionary mechanism, it is a mechanism that first and foremost is unguided and undirected, right? And it also is a mechanism that is oftentimes called historically contingent, where it's predicated on a sequence of chance events. And that, if you use the metaphor that's the late Stephen Jay Gould used, that if you rewound the tape of life and let evolution run again, the outcome would be different because of the historically contingent nature, which means that ultimately, there is no direction to life's history. Everything that we see is happenstance, and that includes human beings. That human beings really can't have true meaning or purpose in that kind of a framework. Also, if you argue that humans have evolved just like every other creature, then there's really nothing that distinguishes us as human beings from other creatures. We're no different. Have no greater worth or lesser worth than any other creature that exists. And so to me, the implications of those ideas, again, are disquieting, for someone who holds to a Christian worldview, in that it seems to me like it means that human beings were not necessarily inevitable. It means that, there is no inherent value necessarily to human life. Now, I know that many of my friends who are theistic evolutionists would be opposed to that, but these are conclusions I draw based on the nature of the mechanism. And the problem I see with theistic evolution is I can't tell the difference between most expressions of theistic evolution and the type of evolutionary process an atheist or a materialist would necessarily advocate. So it's one thing to say God used evolution. Well, if that's the case, then how do I see God's fingerprints in that process? And should that process not somehow tell me that human beings were inevitable and that there's something distinct about human beings that mechanism or process can account for? So these are, again, my concerns, and there's not like I'm unique. There's others that share these concerns. But to be fair, there are people who hold to theistic evolution who would probably disagree with my perspective on that.
Yeah, I really appreciated how you were willing to bring out the philosophical issues, because I think sometimes science is kind of viewed as this cold, indifferent process that scientists go through, but inevitably science and philosophy kind of get intertwined. And so I think you agree with that. So I really appreciated you bringing those kind of philosophical concerns out, because I struggle with them as well.
Well, not to belabor this point, but, I know a lot of people who are non-theists or who are atheists who are in the life sciences, and they frankly are just not impressed with the idea of theistic evolution. And I think part of the reason is because they see tacking God onto it as something that people are free to do if they want to, but they just simply don't see God as being anything other than superfluous, right? And so,
yes.
And yet many times these same people who would argue that really, on one hand, science is theologically neutral, on the other hand, have no problem using the nature of the evolutionary process to undermine belief in a creator, right? So you do see a lot of leading evolutionary biologists who argue that by virtue of the nature of evolution itself, there's no way they could ever embrace any form of theism. So it's not just simply my concerns uniquely as a Christian, but I see, evolution used oftentimes as an argument against Christian theism.
Yeah, and for listeners too, just to piggyback on that, Dr. Rana does lay out in the book thinkers from today and thinkers from the past that share some of those philosophical concerns that he has. And so if you want more on that, you can find it in there.
I have a question along the lines of chemical evolution, and you have a chapter in the book about that. And in there you write about the origin of life being one of the greatest unanswered questions in science. And you ask the question, why do origin of life researchers feel so confident that chemical evolution produced the first life forms and kickstarted the evolutionary history of life? And for me, as I think about that, I'm thinking, well, let's say you do have all kinds of evidence for evolution on the grand scale and the micro scale, but you have to have something there to do the evolving. But going from non-life to life, I wonder what you see the problems are with maybe making that leap. What makes proponents sort of justify that leap where you don't really have anything to work with?
Yeah, well, I think part of what we're looking at when it comes to chemical evolution, I think is a very strong philosophical commitment to the idea that life evolved, that, that the very first cells emerged through an evolutionary process. And this is shaped, in part because of their philosophical pre-commitments on a personal level, where many of these researchers hold to, philosophical naturalism, but it also reflects, I think, the influence of methodological naturalism, which is this idea that whenever you posit a scientific explanation, it has to be based on mechanism, on natural processes. You can't evoke agency, you can't evoke an appeal to the supernatural. And so it's not uncommon for origin of life researchers to say, we have no clue how life could have evolved. People like Paul Davies talk about the problem being not ignorance about certain details, but a major conceptual lacuna. You have other origin of life researchers, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, other times, in sheer exasperation, saying it looks as if life's origin appears to be a miracle. And yet they oftentimes will follow those statements with the utter confidence that somehow we're going to figure this out. It's just a more difficult, more challenging problem than we ever could have imagined. And part of that confidence stems from, again, a philosophical commitment that science has always figured things out. Eventually it'll figure this out too. And that because of the constraints of methodological naturalism must be some kind of chemical evolutionary explanation.
Yeah, well, it seems to me like back to the philosophical starting point. If someone had pulled back the curtain on reality and said, here's the truth, there's no God, then, of course, and you hold that belief and you say, okay, well, it didn't just pop in there, so it has to be mechanistic. I can understand how it makes perfect sense that, well, we're going to have to find a way to fill in all the blanks because we know it had to go stepwise and not just pop in there.
It just popped in there.
What? What just popped in there?
It just seems so obvious to me like this is a philosophical pre-commitment because the evidence doesn't get you there. You have to start there if you've already decided that you can't allow a divine foot in the door, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I've had the privilege of interacting with origin of life researchers over the years, and quite honestly, many of them would identify themselves as philosophical naturalists, as atheists, materialists, but they haven't really given it much thought other than to say, look, I'm a scientist and this is the way we do science. And I guess I'm an atheist because I've never thought about it, and so they don't, I think, fully appreciate the influence of philosophy on how they go about approaching science, particularly when it comes to the question of origin. I think scientists are, in my opinion, are highly trained, but very poorly educated. When you go to graduate school, there's nobody encouraging you to take courses in the philosophy of science or the history of science. You just jump right into your discipline. And so you're very well trained in the latest ideas in your discipline. You're trained in how to work in the lab and use the latest cutting edge techniques. And then you just simply understand that, methodological naturalism is the backdrop, but you're never, ever presented with a case for why it has to be that way. And so I don't think most scientists even think about it to the point where when you suggest the possibility of a creation model or intelligent design, they look at you as if you are completely nuts, but without really appreciating, the philosophical rationale for why you would even posit that idea and how you could even defend incorporating agency into science. They just look at you befuddled as to how you could ever even think about something like that. And it reflects really philosophical naivety on their part, more so than anything.
Yeah, I got a kick out of, just as a side note, watching, I think it was on Capturing Christianity, but don't quote me on that, but there was a dialogue between James Tour, who, as you know, is quite involved in Origin of Life. That's an understatement. And Joshua Swamidass. I don't know if you saw it. And it was hilarious because James Tour is just a very animated guy anyway. And I'm going by what I've seen online. And he just kept saying, Joshua, we have no evidence for how life began.
Well, to me, the irony of this is that Origin of Life researchers have spent 70 years working in prebiotic chemistry and have done some, very interesting experiments, to be fair. But what has come out of that, 7 decades of work is that the work they've done in the lab doesn't necessarily translate to the conditions of the early Earth. That is, in the lab, you have, Origin of Life researchers as intelligent agents who are jimmy rigging the experimental design to ensure success. And that jimmy rigging is absolutely critical. And there's no way that could happen under the conditions of the early Earth. And so I'm seeing a growing number of Origin of Life researchers recognizing what they call the hand of God dilemma, where what the researcher is doing as a researcher is intervening into the actual experimental design to such a degree that they are responsible for the success of the experiment, and that to replicate that on the conditions of the early Earth would require agency as well. But of course, there aren't organic chemists there. And so you are beginning to see Origin of Life researchers literally butting up against this idea of agency being a critical part of chemical evolution. But almost to a person, when they bring up the hand of God dilemma, they make it a point to say, look, we're not advocating intelligent design when we do this. But in effect, they are, right?
Sure. Yeah, that leads really great to kind of the next part of the question, because that we had was one of the things that you say in chapter 6 on this topic of chemical evolution. You say, Origin of Life researchers have no idea how life originated. They claim that prebiotic chemistry provides them with clues, but as we have shown, these studies better provide proof for intelligent agency. So I was just wondering if you could maybe share with us like one way you would say through your work that you've seen how this points more to intelligent agency rather than a spontaneous process.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a little story while I do that. And in the book, I think I give 2 or 3 examples of, major key, landmark experiments in prebiotic chemistry that were used to support like the RNA world hypothesis. And one of them was the assembly of RNA molecules on clay surfaces. And I can remember when these experiments were first published, and there's been about 10 or 15 years worth of work looking at how clay can catalyze, again, the formation of RNA. And many people thought, well, this is great because on the early Earth, there would be clay surfaces, and these could catalyze the formation of RNA molecules. And, there's all kinds of ways this could contribute to chemical evolution. And when you examine the experiments in detail, it becomes evident that the researchers are employing, first of all, chemically pristine conditions where they are very careful to exclude in the experimental design materials that would be present at reasonably high levels on the early Earth that could essentially interfere with the process of RNA chain growth. And so because of that, it's hard to envision how that chain growth would happen on the early Earth. But to me, the kicker is that for these experiments to work, you've got to buy the clay from a special supplier. You have to then treat the clay in the lab in a way to produce this non-natural material that now can serve as a catalyst. You have to use distilled water where there's no ions whatsoever in the water, which is a highly unreasonable scenario. And then they had to use chemically modified RNA subunits or building blocks, and they were modified to facilitate the chemical reaction. And so in other words, this is a highly artificial system that was jimmy-rigged by the researchers and for success. And I remember I was at an Origin of Life conference, and one of the researchers that pioneered this work was a guy named Jim Ferris at SUNY in Buffalo. And he gave like a lecture describing the work that his lab had done over the last decade or so. And during the Q&A portion of that session, an Origin of Life researcher by the name of Robert Shapiro raised his hand, and he said, Jim, as I look at what you've done, from my perspective, what you've done is demonstrated intelligent design. You've not demonstrated chemical evolution. And I was impressed that Jim Ferris didn't blow a gasket. I mean, this guy, you could literally see his face changing from one shade of red to a darker shade of red to a darker shade of red. Because at that point, I mean, it's like you might as well say the F word in church, right? To say intelligent design at an Origin of Life conference, right? And yet Robert Shapiro had a point, because what Jim Ferris did was show how really clever he and his collaborators were in designing these experiments to produce RNA chains. And yet Jim Ferris didn't even appreciate how much he and his co-workers had actually involved themselves in the experimental design. It's really very hard sometimes to see, where you have actually jimmy-rigged things, to such a degree that you've produced the non-natural system. So that I think is a hopefully a good illustration of the point. If it's not for intelligent agency in prebiotic experiment studies, it's questionable if the chemistry would work. And so by analogy, should you not see intelligent agency involved with the origin of life?
Yeah, that is a really super helpful illustration and really funny, which always makes it better.
One of the things we wanted to ask about was chapter 20, where you're talking about the concept of irreducible complexity in biological systems. I think, Chad, you were saying something about watching Michael Behe and Joshua Swamidass discuss this. Say something about that.
Oh, no, it was just, Behe, obviously Darwin's black box, and the work he's done since then was arguing for irreducible complexity. And Swamidass was taking the position that he didn't think that was such a good argument. And so that this chapter particularly grabbed my attention just with that kind of in the back of my mind.
Yeah, I have this love-hate relationship with the idea of irreducible complexity. And I want to be clear, I deeply admire Michael Behe. I like him. I deeply admire him. I think he's an incredibly courageous individual. And his book, Darwin's Black Box, had a real impact on me. It really inspired me to think about how I could make my own argument, for design. And I did that in a book called The Cell's Design. And so I again have nothing but respect and admiration for Michael Behe. And to me, the idea of irreducible complexity, which is in a nutshell, a system that is composed of a number of parts that have to interact precisely to accomplish a purpose. And if any one of those parts is absent, or any one of those parts even doesn't interact in the just right way, that system doesn't have function. And so Behe's point is that kind of a system has to come together all at once. It can't come together in a stepwise manner, because those intermediate stages don't have function. Therefore, there's nothing for selection to choose. And when I first heard the argument, I initially found the argument compelling. And yet over the years, as I listened to critiques of the argument, I began to appreciate, I think, what I see to be some flaws in that argument. Now, to me, I think irreducible complexity is a bona fide marker for design. We make systems that are designed, and oftentimes they're irreducibly complex. So I don't think it's wrong to say, hey, if biochemical systems are irreducibly complex, design, intelligent design, is a legitimate option. But I think it's the way that you can structure the argument that makes the argument vulnerable. So in other words, if you say evolution can't produce irreducibly complex systems, therefore they must be designed, now you've made a vulnerable argument, because all somebody has to do is come along and even suggest a plausible or a feasible way in which evolution could create those kind of systems, and your argument unravels, or your argument loses its thrust. So, for example, evolutionary biologists argue that a process called co-option could explain how, irreducibly complex systems come into being, where those intermediate stages have distinct function from the final stage, right? And that evolution is coming along and co-opting either the system or parts of that system to cobble together new systems with new functions. And that process can go on until you arrive at the system that you're studying today. Now, to be fair, I've yet to see anybody propose anything that I would consider to be a reasonable, example of how that would work in real life. So I've never seen a detailed model that felt compelling to me. However, I think in principle, that is a reasonable rejoinder to the argument. And so therefore, it's not an argument that I would necessarily use, simply because I think it is a vulnerable argument. And by the way, I think irreducible complexity is just one way you could argue for design in biochemistry. And so, my approach would be, let's look at constructing other arguments for design. But at the same time, we really want to make sure that we're being fair to what evolutionary biologists are saying, that when they produce rejoinders to our arguments, that we, listen carefully to what those rejoinders are, and that we really don't dismiss or sidestep the rejoinders with rhetoric, but we actually either engage them directly, or, and I'm not saying that Michael Behe doesn't engage the rejoinders, but to me, I don't want my case for a creator to be essentially distracted into trying to preserve irreducible complexity as an argument for design. I'd rather try to find the best features that I can use to make a case for design. And if irreducible complexity falls into that category, great. If it doesn't, I'll simply set it aside and look for other arguments that people might find to be more compelling or more reasonable.
Yeah. Along that line, I'm interested in how biology makes this positive case. And you talk about in the book something called convergence, where you've got different structures, and you give an example of I don't know the names of these lizards or whatever, but one of them has a really complex eye and different lenses and stuff. And, under an evolutionary paradigm, you've got two different creatures that have different body plans and maybe distinct branches of the evolutionary tree, but they both arrive at this identical highly complex eye design separately. So they both arrive at the same location, but supposedly on different branches. For me, this is a common design feature rather than, wow, isn't it amazing how they just happened to be the same on these different branches? So can you talk a bit about that, what your view is on that, and what power you see in that as far as maybe making a positive case?
Yes. This goes back to the idea of historical contingency that we talked about at the top of the show. And the idea, again, behind historical contingency is that evolutionary processes based on the mechanism of evolution must consist of a sequence of chance events where, the outcome is in effect unpredictable and is essentially not reproducible because, again, it's a sequence of highly improbable events. And so once you've changed one of those events in that sequence, all the other subsequent events are going to be changed. And so as an outworking of that, you would expect that evolution should rarely produce the same outcome. It shouldn't be repeatable. And yet, one of the features that seems to characterize the living realm is, if you're viewing it from an evolutionary perspective, would be what appears to be independent evolutionary origins of very complex, sophisticated biological systems that would have arisen, again, independently in different branches of the evolutionary tree. And again, this is not just a rarity or an oddity, but it is a widespread occurrence. And we see convergence, at the organismal level. We see it, in terms of the way organisms behave. We see it in terms of molecular systems. Every level of biology shows large numbers of examples of convergence. And so to me, that represents a failed prediction of the evolutionary model. Yet at the same time, I would see this as really compelling reasons to think that life stems from the work of a mind, because designers oftentimes will reuse good designs over and over again in different contexts, to accomplish or to solve the same problem. And in fact, when I worked prior to joining Reasons to Believe in R&D for a Fortune 500 company, we had a mantra that we heard over and over and over again for those of us working in R&D, and it was search and reapply. It's like, don't go out and reinvent and invent from scratch new technologies, but rather look and see what other people have done in the company and see if you can take that technology, incorporate it into the particular product you're developing. In fact, we were actually rewarded for reapplying existing technologies to a greater degree than we were rewarded for inventing new technologies. So in other words, not only is it something that designers do, but there's a real elegance or a real logic or a rationale for why, a creator would reutilize the same designs over and over again. And so to me, I see convergence as really not only undermining kind of an evolutionary view for life's origin, but also presenting really a positive case for design.
Just on the heels of that, to what extent does the evolutionary proponent, can they use the same response, well, that's just co-option? Or are these features ones that co-option can't touch because they're too far away, they're not in the same ballpark?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the use of co-option, I think, really works against you when you're trying to explain convergence, because, again, the idea of co-option is you're co-opting an existing design and modifying it to produce a new design. But that process of co-option would still be operating within a framework that would be historically contingent. So it doesn't really help you. The only explanation that I've seen is that, well, if you had the same types of selective forces operating on, two different branches of the evolutionary tree, that those different selective forces would drive evolution to in effect, the same endpoint. But the pathway taken would be different, but yet you'd still hit the same endpoint. The problem is that not only is the process of evolution proper historically contingent, but so is the influence of natural selection. That natural selection, or the selective forces, also are going to be chance forces as well, that are going to sequence in a highly unpredictable, highly irreproducible way. But you also see examples, and this is what you were referring to, Brian, earlier, of organisms that produce the same features, but they would have evolved in very different environments. So, for example, the chameleon has a really interesting visual system where it's two eyes that move independently of one another. So you probably have seen a chameleon where the eyes kind of move separately from one another. Right. Well, the chameleon essentially uses that as a way to focus on to establish its field of vision and focal point. But instead of using a lens to focus light on the retina, it uses a cornea, which has highly specialized muscles that, again, vary the shape of the cornea to allow the light to hit in different regions on the retina, establishes depth perception by kind of rapidly moving the eyes back and forth. Well, this is, again, a really unusual, bizarre visual system. And it turns out that there's a fish called the sandlance that also has that same kind of identical visual system. Well, one animal's a reptile, one animal's a fish, and they have virtually identical visual systems. So you can't argue that these systems evolved with the same set of selective pressures, because the environments that these organisms are in are very different environments.
Yeah, I really like that example quite a bit. Now, one of the chapters 21 talking about William Paley's famous watchmaker argument. From your view, does evolutionary theory these days, does it really demonstrate that Paley's argument fails, or are we in a stronger position now as far as design and biology and what we see?
Yeah, well, I really like Paley's watchmaker argument. And I think Paley is too quickly dismissed today by people from all different, worldview perspectives. And I think Paley really did structure a very strong argument for design. But, one way that we can kind of show that Paley's argument is bolstered is really thanks to work being done in an area called biomemetics and bioinspiration. To me, this is a really interesting, area of research where researchers are essentially using designs in biology to inspire new engineering solutions, to develop new technologies, solve, engineering problems. And, and this is, again, one of the hottest areas in engineering today. And it's amazing to me that engineers can systematically go to designs in biology over and over and over again as, again, inspiration for new technology. And if you think about it, if evolutionary processes were undirected, unguided, if they were, again, co-opting existing designs and cobbling together new designs, that process really ought to produce really these kludge jobs, these things that are cobbled together that are less than optimal, that are inherently flawed. And in fact, you hear many evolutionary biologists say that biological systems are flawed, imperfect systems. But if that was the case, then why would any engineer in their right mind turn to biology to try to solve a problem? It seems to me that biomemetics and bioinspiration is giving us, a strong indication that these designs that we're seeing in biology are really elegant designs that are, superior design in order for them to, again, to inspire engineering. And it allows us to make what I would call the inverse watchmaker argument, which is that if indeed life is the product of a creator, then we would expect that those designs would be so elegant that they could inspire our technologies. And so, in other words, biomemetics and bioinspiration doesn't fit very comfortably in a framework that argues that the designs in biology are the product of a blind watchmaker, but rather it seems to me that these, designs that we're seeing, again, must be the work of a watchmaker that is an intelligent agent, not, again, natural selection, because natural selection would not produce consistently designs that could inspire new technology. So I think that area of research really gives strength, to the watchmaker argument, not to mention, all the insights that we're gaining from biochemistry with regard to the eerie resemblance between, biochemical systems and man-made design.
Mm-hmm.
So the junk DNA discussion, you deal with this in chapter 23, whether or not it's evidence for evolution. This is a discussion that I've been interested in for many years. Can you kind of fill us in on what scientists mean by junk DNA and how that debate has, for lack of a better word, evolved in recent years? Also, just kind of where is that at as far as, is it good evidence for evolution, or maybe does it point toward intelligent agency?
Well, if I was going to press for the case for common descent and the shared evolutionary history for life, to me, the place where I think I would make my strongest argument or attempt to make my strongest argument would essentially involve shared features in genomes of organisms that naturally group together that appear to be non-functional. Because so these non-functional sequences have historically been referred to as junk DNA sequences. And so the idea would be, you could produce a common design argument or a shared evolutionary argument for designs in biology that have functional purpose, that are shared, right? If they're functional and they're shared, it makes sense that a creator would utilize those designs. So shared functionality isn't really uniquely a case for, common descent. However, if those features are non-functional and they're shared, then you believe that that non-functionality is generated through evolutionary processes, that's very powerful evidence for common descent. And this is, how junk DNA has been used to really build a case for an evolutionary history of life. Why would a creator introduce identical non-functional sequences in the same corresponding locations in genomes of organisms that, again, naturally cluster or group together? And yet what we've seen over the last, decade or so now is that increasingly virtually every class and type of junk DNA has function attributed to it. And we're beginning now to understand why some of these so-called junk DNA sequences bear similarity to, quote unquote, those functional sequences that we think they are derived from. And so now that we have identified function for junk DNA sequences and we understand the rationale for why they look the way they look, you can now argue that those shared features, again, are consistent with shared design or common design as opposed to common descent. So in other words, that the discovery of function for junk DNA doesn't necessarily elevate the design argument above an evolutionary interpretation of life. But what it does mean is that the evolutionary interpretation for life isn't now the best or the only explanation for those shared features. So we talk about pseudogenes as an example in that chapter. We don't have the space to go into an exhaustive discussion about junk DNA. I've actually have on the back burner a book project dealing with the whole junk DNA question. I don't know if and when I'll get to it, but that seems to me to be an area that needs to be further explored. And there's been some really good work that's already been published out there by ID theorists and Christian apologists. But I think it's an area that still deserves much more work because of how prominent junk DNA is in terms of building the case for common descent.
Just a neat story. I was having lunch years ago with a biologist who he's a working scientist who works at an area fort in where I live, and he works on different viruses and things like this. And we were having a discussion about evolution and biology, and it was obviously his field and not mine. And the topic of junk DNA came up, and he had shared how he thought that was in supportive of, his position. And I was able to say to him, well, have you been looking at any of the recent, because he had been out of school and been working, I said, have you been looking at any of the recent discoveries of function in junk DNA? And he said, no. And so I had been just kind of reading just casually some of the ID theorists who were coming up with that. And I sent him some of the links, and his eyes were really open through that. He definitely found that challenging. That was encouraging.
Yeah, that is good to hear.
Well, as we start to wrap up, really we appreciate your time, Fuz, and
yes, absolutely,
and all the work that you and other scholars have done on the book. A bit of a non-related question to the book, though, would be, if there's people maybe listening who are thinking about going into the different sciences, I'm wondering if you have any advice that you'd want to share with young Christians who want to become professionals in that area, what steps they might be able to take that would serve that profession as well as serving Christ primarily, and any pitfalls you'd warn them against. What would you say to someone who's looking into that?
Yeah, well, to me, I would first of all encourage young people who really are interested in science, regardless of the area of science, to really view that as essentially a ministry and a calling that God can have on your life. Because if God has revealed himself to us through the record of nature, as a scientist, you have the privilege of firsthand investigating God's revelation to us from nature. And if you are able to gain new insights and then communicate that to both people inside and outside the church, you are helping to reveal God to everyone. And in some respects, I think many times as churches, we neglect to recognize that the scientists that are in our congregation really could be important worship leaders, just, giving people a sense of awe about the amazing world that we live in. But also, I think that there's many areas right now that are incredibly exciting areas in science and technology. I'm thinking particularly at areas like synthetic biology, where scientists are beginning to use genetic engineering techniques to engineer life, to create novel, non-natural life forms. And this is the next generation in the technology revolution. It's going to change our world, both in good ways and bad ways. And I think this is an area where Christians need to be involved, simply because I think there's a wisdom that Christians bring to the table that I think is important. There's an ethical framework that Christians bring to the table that's important. We need to have expertise or people that are experts in these areas that have a Christian worldview that can help shape how that technology is used. But also, I think some of the most powerful design arguments are going to be found in synthetic biology in years to come. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of good that can be accomplished. And, if you are a young person going into the sciences, I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time reading through and thinking through the philosophy of science and recognizing how philosophy is going to influence the way that your professors are teaching the information to you in your courses. And that I don't think as a student you necessarily should feel obligated to try to take on your professors, but recognize that many times they are arguing from a particular worldview. They're approaching science with a particular philosophical framework. And if you understand that, and also understand that there's other ways to interpret the data, then your faith can be secure. And then you have the space to figure out really what is the position you're going to embrace when it comes to whether it's old earth creationism or theistic evolution. But recognize you've got a number of options. You've got a number of landing sites. There's a number of examples of Christians in the sciences that you can look to as a way to help sort things out for yourself. But at the end of the day, I don't think you should feel like you've got to somehow challenge your professors, but rather do everything you can just to become the best you can be in your discipline, and you will earn people's respect through that process, so that when the time is right, you can speak out, and you can speak out, from a position of credibility and respect that you've earned. So, to me, I see a lot of young people feeling as if they're in a science class and they got to take their professor on, and they really, I think, don't do anybody any good, in those scenarios. That's a classroom isn't the place to do those types of things, in my opinion. But rather, I think, as a church, we should be helping our students think through these science faith issues, and then encourage them to see their work in science as a ministry, but recognizing there will be a time where they can have a testimony that people will appreciate and be really strongly influenced. So it's not a question of not speaking out. It's a question really of when do you speak out? But as a student, that's not the time, in my opinion.
Well, that's excellent advice.
Yes.
Again, thank you so much for joining us today. You want to point people to your resources? I know we're going to point them to reasons.org. I don't know if that's the only place you'd want to send them. So if you want to go ahead and take that opportunity, I'd appreciate it.
I think if people go to reasons.org, that's probably the best starting place to just expose yourself to the work that we do at Reasons to Believe if you're unfamiliar with our work. And, we all are active on social media. And so that's another place where you can catch up with us is RTB has official Twitter and Facebook and Instagram accounts, and each of the scholars at Reasons to Believe have their own accounts as well. So those are the two ways to kind of check in and find out what we're up to.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
We've been speaking with biochemist Fuz Rana, Vice President of Research and Apologetics at Reasons to Believe. He's the author of several groundbreaking books, including Who is Adam?, Creating Life in the Lab, The Cell's Design, and Humans 2.0. Find more resources from Fuz as well as Reasons to Believe at reasons.org. Remember, you can find a lot of apologetics resources on the apologetics315.com website, along with show notes for today's episode. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com, or you can actually leave a voice message for us using a service called SpeakPipe. Now, you can find that right on the podcast notes page on apologetics315.com and hit the link for leaving us a message. You can record one for us. Include a Ghostbusters quote in your question to guarantee that we will read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. You can find Chad's apologetics stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This is Brian Auden
And Chad Gross
for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Today tastes like heading out the door and driving into town. It tastes like grabbing snacks and a Coke and singing as loud as you can. Today tastes like anything could happen. And it never tasted this good. Summer tastes better with Coca-Cola.
Wherever you're going this week, don't forget to grab an ice-cold, refreshing Coca-Cola.
Me, but also you. The Pharaoh fast forwards his favorite foreign film, Powder Donut. Okay, what's my line?
The only line I see here on the script is get options based on your budget with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive.
Oh man, that's a tongue twister, huh? I'm sorry, I'm gonna need a few more minutes. Bulbous Walrus, the Bulbous Walrus.
The Name Your Price tool, only from Progressive.
The owl ran afoul of the comatose coxswain.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.